Welcome back. So, a lot of music to talk about this time around. So, going to try to keep this brief as possible, and we're just going to try to go through as much as possible. So, we're going to start off with Lil Yachty and his label tape with the Concrete Boys, titled "It's Us Volume One." So, this is the first collaborative tape with the Concrete Boys. Features Camo, Caribou, and I believe Draft Day alongside Lil Yachty, of course. So this is everyone's introduction for most of these artists. Draft Day has done a couple more features and was also on Little Boat 3 for a little while ago. And this is a pretty good start for this label as a group. It does fall into the same problems that a label tape usually has, where it does jump around in its sound. It doesn't have something that it kind of cohesively sticks to. But nonetheless, it's still a decent enough tape with good amount of moments spotted through across the tape to make it consistently interesting throughout. There is some moments where it doesn't really stick out too much and kind of falls to the background, and probably out of all of the artists here, the weakest artist is definitely Caribou. She has a really kind of laid back, lackadaisical voice that can work with certain instrumentals, but sometimes it gets to the point where it really just doesn't stick out among the mix or with other artists. It's very much something that's more probably of an acquired taste, but it's just not for me personally. Overall, it's still a pretty good tape, and Lil Yachty definitely brings some of the best performances on this tape. I could think of L.A. Reid as an example, as kind of more of a solo track for him. That's kind of goes into that Detroit kind of drill sound, but it works out pretty nicely. So overall, still a pretty decent tape. I probably will return to a few tracks off of this thing, but at its current state, I'm probably going to be giving it a 6 out of 10, which does fall in line with the user scores of a 66. There's no critic scores for this thing at the current moment. Wouldn't be surprised if there is going to be none for this. So now we move on to the Black Keys with Ohio Players. So in my before the drop video, I was saying that this would be my first full listen to a Black Keys album in 10 years. The last album that they dropped that I listened to was Turn Blue, and I actually went to a live show. I got free tickets, and I managed to go see them live, and that was the first time I experienced a contact high before. So, looking at the scores for the Black Keys for the Ohio Players, critic score of a 71 and a user score of a 67. Not much has changed for me personally from Turn Blue all the way to Ohio Players. It is very much a Black Keys album. It does sound a little bit more refined in its instrumentation. It sounds a little bit more crisper. It sounds a little bit more kind of, I guess, more modernized. You can tell that there is some progression going on when it comes to its sound and trying to keep up with the current times. And I know there's a certain track on here that features Beck and Juicy J that does kind of make it a little bit more interesting, something that they haven't done before. There's also another track on here at the latter end that actually features a full-on rap verse, which does go over decently well. But if you're looking for more the Black Keys, alt rock, blues rock kind of sound, you're going to get this again. Again, it does sound a little bit more polished. It sounds a little bit more refined, and it does have a really good start and a relatively decent closer. It's that middle portion is where you kind of fall into kind of the cyclical nature. It's just like this blues rock kind of cycle just over and over and over again. It really doesn't reinvent the wheel too much to make it kind of stand out amongst their discography. It's not like an El Camino. It's not like a Brothers. Even Turn Blue, when the time it came out, that was a little bit more experimental in their sound from what I remember listening to that record. So this one kind of falls on its laurels a little bit more, but I still liked it a fair amount. So with that, I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. I still think it was decent enough, and there's a couple of tracks that I do enjoy off this thing. I'm trying to catch my breath here. So now we move on to the one that I was completely in the dark with. So this is Mount Kimby with the Sunset Violent. So it has a critic score of a 78 and a user score of a 76. So relatively good scores for a relatively pretty good album that kind of falls into, I use this term a couple of times, where it's almost like the surf rock kind of feel, where it does feel like very syrupy. It feels really smooth. It feels kind of groovy to it. One of my favorite tracks is Shipwreck. It kind of, once it gets into a tone, once it gets into an atmosphere of this kind of alt rock sound, it really hits a nice groove where it feels very hypnotic, and it really kind of immerses you into the sound that they're going for. And the two tracks, which features King Cruel. King Cruel is one of my favorite artists, and he works very well into the sound as well, obviously, because he's been kind of going for the sound for the past little while. I'm thinking Mount Heavy, I believe, was his last album, where he kind of was going into that sound too. Works about the same here. So overall, it's a pretty good listen. It's only about 37 minutes. There's only 9 tracks, so you do get a nice compact listen throughout, and you do get a good idea of what Mount Kimby is looking for and kind of what their sound is. So I'm also going to be giving this a 7 out of 10. Pretty good album. Now we move on to something that's a little bit more divisive for me, which is the Bryson Tiller self-titled album. So there's a critic score of a 90 on here from, I believe it's Clash. I didn't get to read it. That's why I put, there's only one review that gave us a 90. I'm not going to be surprised to see that score come down. And it is a user score of a 54. It keeps going down a little bit. So this is the first Bryson Tiller albums I've listened to in a little while. Again, I really like Trap Soul. I think True to Self or Note to Self, I'm trying to remember what the title is of that second one that he dropped. I think there was some really good tracks on there, but he's kind of fallen off into kind of the background when it comes to that mix of R&B, trap, hip hop. He's kind of fallen into the background of that. So coming back with this one, this album does have a pretty strong start, and I'm trying to figure out my favorite probably track on here is the one with Victoria Monet that kind of takes this really fun lyrical approach where you think it's going to say like dick, but it goes to the dictionary, or it's going to say pussy and it's like persuasion. It's a fun little track that Victoria Monet and Bryson Tiller do provide a nice little bit of vocal chemistry. And overall, I think this album does have some good production mixed throughout and makes it a little bit more livelier, especially considering that Bryson Tiller kind of has this voice that can kind of just fall into the background a little bit more. So having those beats that make it stand out a little bit more is a nice kind of add-on to make it sound a little bit more interesting. But I think this album, after about the 6th or 7th track, or even about like the 4th or 5th, honestly, this album does take quite a bit of a dip, and it does start to fall into the territory of being really, really samey. You do get 1 or 2 tracks towards the end that kind of pick up the pace a little bit more, and you do have singles like Calypso, and you have the bonus track, which do provide a little bit more of differentiation from this album. But this is an album to me that is very much in the middle. It's very much doesn't really provide anything that is going to blow your mind when it comes to Bryson Tiller or R&B in general. It's very much in that middle ground for me where it's not bad enough to make it interesting to discuss, but it's not good enough either to kind of like talk about its major strong points, because I don't think it really has anything that reaches a crazy high that you would kind of hope for a sound like this. So with this one here, I'm going to be giving it a 5 out of 10 because, again, it just falls into that kind of middle area where it's not bad, but it's not good either. It just doesn't do enough. And I feel like Bryson Tiller as a vocalist, and he definitely has a great selection for beats. I feel like he can do so much better. And I feel like he's been punching under his weight for a little while now. So now we move on to 2 of the albums that I am the most excited to talk about. So the first one is Novo Amor of Collapse List. So there is no critic score for this, but it's at a user score of a 77. And the last album was Cannot Be Whatsoever. I remember from my last video that I completely forgot the album title. It's Cannot Be Whatsoever, one of my favorite albums of the decade. And this album kind of falls into the same sound of Cannot Be Whatsoever, where it is very much of an ambient folk singer-songwriter album. But reading up more about this record and kind of the ideas around this record of how Novo Amor moved out, I believe it's from Belfast or somewhere that was kind of a lot more urbanly populated, and kind of moving out to the country and building his own studio. And this album is probably is sounds of maturity, it sounds of growth, and it sounds of trying to kind of pick up from the pieces. And especially considering that Cannot Be Whatsoever came out among the midst of the pandemic. This is the first album for Novo Amor that's almost post-pandemic. I know there was the Antarctic and Ambient album, but I consider this more of a follow-up from Cannot Be Whatsoever. So this album, again, is just serene. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. It does have some amazing vocal passages on this thing. And there's a couple moments of interludes that you get, those kind of ambient interludes that you got from the Antarctican tape, and they just accent these songs so much nicer. And the cohesive listening experience of this thing, really what you need to do is just like go for a walk or go for a hike and listen to this thing. Because man, when you're walking around in nature listening to something as beautiful, as serene, as majestic as this album sounds, it really amplifies and makes this album one of the most beautiful listens of the year. I remember, I think it was around the second or third track of this thing, I was driving back home. I'm trying to remember what I was driving back from, honestly. And I haven't had this happen a little bit, but I just started crying, honestly, because there's moments of just this serenity and this beauty on this album that doesn't need words, it doesn't need lyrics to really portray it. Just this sound can cause an emotion and a soundscape all on its own, and it's really impressive when an album can do that. So overall, this is a 9 out of 10. I love this thing. It's probably going to be in my top 10, maybe even top 5, depending on how this year goes. But man, another amazing album, and I'm going to be seeing him in September. I'm going to cry probably multiple times when I'm go see them. So, Vampire Weekend, Only God Was Above Us. Critic score of an 86. User score of an 83. This is probably one of Vampire Weekend's best albums. Now, from the Before the Drop video, I was talking about Father of the Bride, which is still a really good album, but it was a little bit more of a weaker point in their discography, especially considering it was a double album. It was a little bit of a bigger kind of pill to swallow when it comes to the album. So, this album seems like the start of kind of going away from the Seasons kind of sound. But this album sounds the most like Modern Vampires of the City, which is my favorite Vampire Weekend album. But what it does is that where Modern Vampires definitely still had a little bit those moments of the grandeur of the nature and a little bit more kind of bigger in its scope, it was definitely the most dialed back Vampire Weekend album. This is if you take Modern Vampires and elevate everything and make it so grandiose in scope, and you get something that's a lot more kind of textured, something that's a lot more kind of meticulous in the way that it sounds. It is a roller coaster ride at some points. It gets to points where it can be incredibly beautiful, especially when I'm thinking about Mary Boone and its amazing kind of almost choral vocals that were kind of showing up on Father of the Bride. But in this particular context of this album, it makes it sound so much more beautiful and so much more just very interesting. And you get some amazing tracks on here. And I know there was a lot of singles released to this thing, and that's the unfortunate part, is like I wish that some of these weren't released as singles. But Classical and Capricorn are two of the best Vampire Weekend songs that have been out for a very long time. Particularly Capricorn, the way that it has this kind of groove and this breakdown, it is so just addicting to listen to, and it's so well crafted, this thing. And Ezra Koenig, the singer of Vampire Weekend, still is bringing some great performances. And the band as a whole is just firing on all cylinders on this thing. So I totally understand the massive critical praise that this is getting. And it's going to get another one for me. And it's going to be a 9 out of 10. So 2 of these albums are at high contention for my album of the year. So that is all of the music I listen to. And that's not even all of it. So there's a couple of other albums that I've been listening to on the side. Of course, that will show up on the month-end list. But man, it was a decent week for music. Did have a couple of really, really good ones, had a couple amazing ones, and 2 that kind of fell in the middle. But overall, I think every week so far has provided something of note and something that has been really just great for music in general. And we have the Metro album that's coming out this Friday. Man, this is going to be a very interesting week, and especially the fallout of the J. Cole situation. I think we're starting to get into some really interesting territory. So, thank you for watching. Go listen to these albums if you want. What are your thoughts on them? And have a very good day.